All right, welcome, Len. You're on.
Okay, thank you. We divided up this system education four experiments into two talks because there were 123 slides the last time I did it, and there's 43 today. That would have been 166 or 170, which would have been too much for one sitting. So we're still on several systems education experiments. Shall I go ahead then, Peter?
He's gone. Yes, continue.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for bringing us blue jeans and putting us all on and arranging all of this. So last time, for the several education experiments, and I am going to again this time, why we call these experiments in systems education. But I've grayed out that first one because it was 124 slides. Um, and we're not doing that this time. We took care of integrated science general education and the National Science Foundation.
You turn the video on.
Could everybody mute their audio, please?
Hey, Len, this is Scott. I'm
Hi,
not
Scott.
using. Can you hear? Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. I'm
Yes,
not
I
using my
can.
telephone. What?
So they want all the mics muted because there's feedback sometimes.
I heard you, but
So,
trying to make a statement. Um,
okay, go ahead.
uh, my statement is I'm decided not to use my telephone today, so I just want to find out if you can hear me. Okay.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Great. Okay. I'm gonna mute now.
Okay, thank you, Scott, for joining us. So this time we're going to still very briefly talk about experiments in systems education, but this time we're going to concentrate on a UC San Diego course on unbroken sequence of origins, which is now about 15 slides. This happened with 17 guest speakers. There were even Nobel laureates at that talk. And I presented my unbroken sequence of systems origins, which I abbreviate, thank the Lord, to that brief for USSO and the new theory of emergence. We're recording this time also for the next thing, which is a graduate course, which I'm teaching this particular semester, Introduction to Systems Science for Systems Engineers, which is part of our master's program to earn a master's in systems engineering at Cal Poly University in California. That's the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, not San Luis Obispo. One of my colleagues that I went to graduate school with tried to visit me at Cal Poly, but it turned out he was in San Luis Obispo, and he says, "You're not where you say you are." But it was because I was down south. That course, SE 5100, is now being offered completely online. It has 30 televised lectures in it, and this will be lecture 27 in that series. And then, because ISSS has been very, very conscious of systems education in the last few meetings, I wanted to bring them up to date on past ISSS efforts during the time period from the 70s to the 90s when I was working with ISSS, because they don't know anything about several reports. So I'm going to bring that up at the end so they're up to date. There's been 50 years of interest in ISSS systems education and 9 reports that I'm going to mention. And I'll end with conclusions about systems education that might inform the current interest in it. So why do we call these experiments like the integrated science general education, which I just bored you with 125 slides about last time in this series? Well, the definition of experiment in this concept text, at least, is a procedure carried out to support, refute, or validate a hypothesis. It involves things like repeatability analysis, controls, collection and analysis of data. In this context, our hypothesis is that teaching systems is fundamental and should be involved in higher education. I'm going to feature past attempts. We're still trying to get it right. Usually systems education was carried out by a center or an institute. it was less often a line unit. By line unit, I mean a standard department that you find at almost all universities, or a standard school or college, which is a subset of the whole university. Usually it's externally funded, so it's very dependent on that funding. It's also dependent on student demand and graduation, but we're going to see that both of those aren't enough to keep a program going. So we want to learn from our past mistakes at ISSS. One of the death signals to me is a change in administration. Someone who is tolerating or at least perhaps enabling or even was interested, who is a president, a dean, or a chair in the systems approach. But then when you get a new chair, a new dean, or a new president, it really changes. So one needs to prepare for the legacy and the continuation of a unit from the outset. I had the Institute for Advanced System Studies, for example, at California State Polytechnic University, but I didn't plan for the legacy, and as a result, as soon as I retired, it was eliminated. And another example I have is I actually was picked as the first director of the Center an institute that was at the University of Louisville when James G. Miller took over. He wanted a systems institute there, and he was president, and he put aside, $30,000-$40,000 to do that, and I helped him set it up during the summer. And he wanted me to join them, but I didn't join them because I figured as soon as the president changed, it would be terminated. And sure enough, as soon as James G. Miller, one of our outstanding first founders, or founder associates, when he retired as president of the University of Louisville, they ended that program. So there are some surviving experiments. For example, the State University of New York Clear's old program, but it'll be interesting to see what happens now that George Clear is he passed away. Another one is at Portland State University. It's an interdisciplinary, cross-departmental program. And Marty Zwick, Wayne Wakeland, Harold Lindstone, George Landeris are all at that Portland State University. I'm going to talk about it toward the end of this talk and whether it'll survive or not. Then there's things like Santa Fe Institute or NEXI courses. Those are pretty rigorous, but at the same time, and they're surviving, but at the same time, they're truly not general systems oriented. They're systems, you might say, associated. So of these 4 experiments, we're now going to go into Systems Education 2 experiment, which was a course called Frontiers of Science in 1986 at University of California, San Diego. Now, University of California, San Diego, UC Irvine, UC Berkeley are all outstanding schools. And in fact, they were just in the top 15 or so nationwide in a recent study. So I ran a Frontiers of Science course in 1986, at least that's what they called it. And the themes were essentially the unbroken sequence of systems origins, which I now espouse, and my theory of emergence. But of course, it wasn't called those things. That was just the themes. And I'm going to now show you the 1986 preserved syllabus on the next 5 slides. Peter, I still have all the people showing on here, which is great because I love all your faces and your participation, but it's blocking the slides. Is that happening for all of you? And Peter, how do I get rid of them?
Peter's not here. Peter's not here anymore, and
okay.
It's not blocking us. So you just have to somehow select them, usually at the top of the frame, and move it out of the way.
Okay, I did, and you're right.
The slides, okay.
It's out of the way now. So I can't see your faces. So you make faces at me. That's great. So the next 5 slides are this preserved syllabus. Why am I putting it there? Well, it was attended by roughly 100 UCSD students, plus 17 famous scientists as invited lecturers. It covered the origins of many natural systems. So it actually started with physical systems all the way to human systems. And that was by intentional design. Somebody wants to interrupt, that's fine. Just break in. I have all the notes from the guest lectures, and I should have typed them up into a textbook, but I didn't. I was still in the graduate student mode, even though I had got my PhD 15 years earlier when I ran this course. And so I took extremely detailed notes as a cell molecular biologist is trained to do. So there's well over 100 pages of notes, and that's excluding my notes. And I use them in my own evolution course, Bio 213, from approximately 1975 to 2008. The reason that's important to me is that this thing was in 1986. 1975 to 2008, when I was structuring these things, is not cited anywhere by the people who are starting to become interested in this again. So I still can write up these notes, and I would appreciate an email from you telling me what you think. Should I still publish that book? And in fact, it's too bad George Mobus isn't here, although we have an 8 a.m. conference call on Saturday, I think, about this, because it's shared with a number of people I'm going to show you in just a moment. So anyway, it's a tremendous overview of origins at all scalar levels, as you can see from the syllabus on the next 4 or 5 pages. I was able to present this to a very well-connected audience. They're very high-level scientists, but they were not much interested in systems origins in those days, in '86, per se, relative to the origins in their particular disciplines. The next slide showed they were very authoritative in their particular specialties in those times. But as it is true nowadays too, they're not interested in the general systems origins. I was able to present to these people my early theories on systems emergence, which really is a broader alternative to Darwin's theory of evolution, because it talks about the evolution or the emergence or the origin of all systems. And Darwin's theory only talks about new speciation. But it wasn't particularly appreciated. Unfortunately, it was never repeated. This course was Frontiers of Science, which is kind of an open course that you have at some universities so that you can invite big speakers. You know, the curriculum is pretty open in that case. The participants were extremely reductionist, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Why do I even call this then an experiment in systems education? Well, because the theme I imposed on it, since I was the one who coordinated the class and invited the speakers, was the origins of new levels of reality, which is new entities of systems, new types of systems. And so it had a systems, very strong systems emphasis, even though it wasn't called that. So here is the original syllabus for that, and so it was 138 Frontiers of Science. It was held for 2 hours on Tuesday and Thursdays at UC San Diego in the fall quarter 1986. Let's look at some of the talks here. Integrative themes. Grobstein and Troncale started this off and gave it its systems emphasis. But then Thomson took over, and he talked about the origins of matter and the physical laws and their dynamics. This is a very broad sort of thing, and this is Thomson in his younger days anyway. Almost all these speakers I'm talking about now have passed away. I'll note when some of them have passed away. Then it went on from Thomson to emergence of matter and the structure of the cosmos with Big Bang cosmology. And Smith was the one who talked about that. And then the emergence of elements and stars. Of course, elements are the very beginnings of the periodic table of chemistry. And that was done by Margaret Burbidge. This particular picture of her is a delightful young picture. Do you know that Margaret still survives of all these speakers, and she's 100 years old this year? And then Arrhenius took over, and he talked about the emergence of planetary bodies and various geological mechanisms. So you can see we're progressing through what happened in time from the Big Bang cosmology about 13.6 billion years ago. Then we were privileged to have Miller of the Miller and Urey group. Miller got the Nobel Prize for the very beginnings of origins of life. Um, we continued now with template-directed synthesis by Orgel. That's a picture of Orgel, Leslie Orgel, and he is famous for the RNA origins of the genetic code and many other things. He was famous in those days and is still famous. Then the earliest cells were covered by Aramik. Actually, this person here, he's holding a great big rock because he's a geologist. And then Loomis took over discussing the earliest cells, the biochemical principles of prokaryotic and eukaryotic diversion. And then Doolittle was one of my heroes as a graduate student. He was the one who was famous for work on the early polymers, and he did a lot of sequence studies that showed which ones came first. Let's see, did I miss somebody? Yes, Woodruff and then Grobstein talked about then once life had begun on the molecular level and reproduction because of genetics, then of course it diversified, and he talked, Grobstein, about macroevolutionary emergence and increasing complexity and emergence of integrative mechanisms. He talked about the immunoglobulins and multicellular organisms across cells from close to related to us to distant. And I broke in there with some of the systems origins too. Then we continued in these talks by Bullock, who's shown here, and he talked about brains and from jellyfish to primates. And he was, as I'll show you later, a major neuroscientist. And then we continued with Washburn, who talked about the origins of the human species, and Trinkhaus, who's famous for a lot of newsworthy events in the discovery of the early human civilizations. Then Jonas Salk, who is well known and famous also, talked about emergence and metascience. And of course, we define system science now, or at least I do, in terms of metascience. And then we talked about a unified theory of emergence toward the end. Ted Melnicek, I'll talk about a little bit later too, who talked about this concept of metascience. So ignore the grading here. There was about 20 total lectures by invited speakers from the physical sciences all the way through the biological on the molecular level to the biological on the organism level, all the way to human civilizations. But look at that last paragraph, because this didn't turn out to happen. Students interested in doing independent research on one of the lecture topics may write an integrative essay. I don't have any of those essays, I don't think, left, but encouraging students to do research in this area was important, although now it's become more famous again. So Clifford Grobstein and I met because he was a famous developmental biologist, and I wanted to meet him because I was living closer or between Cal Poly, which is in Pomona, and San Diego. And of course, he allowed me to become the coordinator and design this course on the origins of everything, really, which is popular as a title for books nowadays. But I want to say that it was because Clifford Grobstein that we got all these famous people. It wasn't because of me. So there were many famous speakers. I'm going to spend 2 slides on this, who had already established fame at the time of Grobstein and I running this, like the Nobel laureate Stanley Miller of the Miller and Urey famous experiment, which started the origin of life series of experiments. He was very easy to talk with, and I got to talk with all these people. There were several others who were members of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, and also the Royal Society of London, the original scientific society issue, read in history books. It started with Isaac Newton and others. Russell Doolittle, for instance, was a biochemist who studied the structure and evolution of proteins. He calculated the divergence of all organisms from a common ancestor. He received the Ehrlich and Carty prizes. We're going to have several of these people who got the Carty prizes. I'm not going to bore you with it, though. Leslie Orgel was famous for nucleosynthesis and the concept of RNA being the first replicating species of molecule in the world, not DNA. So he did work on the origins of life, and he worked at Salk. He worked with Crick, for example. I already showed you that picture of Margaret Burbidge, who's now 100. She and her husband were gold medalists of the Royal Society in the United Kingdom. They were astrophysicists. They had positions at Harvard and Caltech, a director of Kitt Peak Observatory, National Academy of Sciences. Together they proposed the oscillatory alternative to Big Bang, which is still alive, and directed the Royal Greenwich Observatory. But they're famous for the B2FH theory, which is really stellar nucleosynthesis, and I'll mention it again in a moment. We also had, for the National Academy and Royal Society, Len Troncale, who's a paleoanthropologist. He talks widely on the origins of humans. He's often quoted in the popular press. As I say, most of these people have passed away now, though they were famous at one point. He talked and introduced the idea of hybrid humans at the origins, which is actually now just getting really a lot more recent support. Some of them were just famed and not Nobel laureates or members of the National Academy, like Jonas Salk, who started the Salk Institute, the famous Salk Institute in San Diego. He was the scientist who developed a vaccine that stopped the polio epidemic. Since I suffered from polio when I was younger, it was really a thrill to meet Jonas Salk, who probably saved my life. And I continue with Clifford Gromstein. I had several meetings with him. He believed in me, and he believed in the transdisciplinary approach. All of these people were very open-minded, even though they were world-famous reductionists. Like he was a world-famous developmental biologist. He also was a cancer researcher. He was the first dean of the UCSD School of Medicine that brought a lot of the great names to San Diego. Others were members of the AAS and Guggenheim Fellows. AAS is the American Astronomical Society. In fact, I'm sitting as I'm delivering this in the Wilson offices that is paid for by the Wilson Foundation. Albert G. Wilson was the director of Lowell Observatory and an astrophysicist also. So it kind of brings everything together, doesn't it, that I'm sitting here. Russell Doolittle graduated from Harvard. He did the structure and evolution of proteins I mentioned before. He was a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carty Award winner. He was one of my idols as a graduate student, I think I mentioned. And Margaret Burbidge was the first female president of the American Astronomical Society. And a Guggenheim Fellow too. So see, this was a small circle of very famous people. Ted Bullock was a founding father of neuroethology. This is a quote from him: "Neuroscience should be continuous with ethology, ecology, and evolution." That's what he worked on, comparative approach, looking for unifying principles. Incidentally, he got the Ralph W. Gerard Prize, and as you remember, in general systems theory, which started this society, ISSS, when it was ISGSR, Gerard was one of the 4 founding fathers that's recognized by everybody. I'll mention just one more. Gustav Arrhenius was famous as a geochemist and oceanographer. He worked on the origins of the solar system and cosmochemistry, which is now an accepted word, but in those days was an interdisciplinary field. He started his work by studying the deepest earth cores, proving the history of the earth. His paternal grandfather was a Nobelist. He died just this year, and he was a Guggenheim Fellow. So this was an incredibly important series. and I wish I had written the book on it. Now I'm going to go into a chronological chart on basically the origins of the universe. And a lot of people, I did this at Gary Smith's request because there's a number of people who are now becoming interested in this, but they don't cite any of the past people for some reason. And it's very irritating because in science you're supposed to cite the past lineages that led to where we are now. And I go back to the great chain of being that were philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists. And this was different from our current work, quite different, because God was at the top. There was a progression downward, even though complexity increases usually across evolution. It was directed creation. It was hierarchical in the ancient sense of top down, not bottom up hierarchies. It was clearly not the flows of Heraclitus that came in the Greek period too, but rather the static ideals. And then that was picked up by Linnaeus in the Renaissance humanist period in the 1700s, where he made the Scala Naturae, which was an organization of all the species on Earth. But even though he ordered them, it was an ordering of fixed species because he taught the eternality of species, which was the religious dogma of the time. But then it was picked up in 1936 by Arthur Lovejoy, who talked about the great chain of being. He was an American philosopher and historian, but he actually was looking at the history of the idea, not research into the idea itself. And so it was more in this fixed, which is different. That's why I put in the cron chart, I put this as the 0th level. Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest, and he published in the 50s a series of books. He was a French philosopher, and he still had God at the top, but he had a continuous evolution to the noosphere, which was from the astrospheres, the physical would actually develop into the spiritual. But he didn't specify the science at the origin events at each level at all. He just talked about, he was a scientist, so he talked about the anthropology. So we don't start the systems view until the 70s, the 1970s, with Ken Boulding, who's another of the founders of the ISGSR, General Systems Theory. But if you look at Boulding's ladders, which are constantly being cited nowadays in the modern literature by people like Wilby and so on, these are sequences, not in the sense of origins. It doesn't talk about origins per se. It talks about types of systems, and mostly the increase in complexity in mostly just one isomorph feedback. And then it continues in the later 60s of 1900 and even to the present time. Morowitz has been, and that's the second picture there, going down. And he was a biophysicist. He focused on the origins of life. Most of his work, most of his writing was on it, but it's all confined to biology. His co-author, Eric Smith, just released a new book after the death of Morowitz, which continues in the same line, but includes geological and chemical results of the modern day. It still focuses on how living system cells capture throughput energy as non-equilibrium systems. In other words, they dissipate the original energy coming from the sun. Like Odom's work, Eric Smith from Santa Fe, and so many more are really not entirely systems oriented. Then I include John D. Barrow, whose books I have next to me here. All through the 80s and 90s, he wrote books like The Anthropic Cosmological Principle in 1986, Theories of Everything in 91, and The Origin of the Universe in 94. For some reason, these modern workers in the ISSS are not citing these old works, and these people have concentrated, perhaps because it's mostly physical systems, on the origins. And then I come in there because since 1972, my first paper in the ISSS, I've been talking about origins and the unbroken sequence of origins, and it was hierarchy intensive. It was the origins of levels of systems, and they don't cite me either. The next 2 Tuesdays are going to be on the unbroken sequence of systems origins, if I'm allowed, with Peter, because they were ISSS workshops. But more people attended those, and actually we're getting together as a group. Some of these people I'm after this slide, who also don't cite me, but these people are continuing with the work on the evolution and origins of things from the beginning. So suddenly there's recently a rediscovery of this by many workers, and some of them completely ignore my integration, diversification cycles that go from the Big Bang all the way to the present. And that includes a lot of cases of the origins of life, too. So it goes and looks at unbroken sequence of systems origins. I say emphasize unbroken because most people think physical systems are different from living systems, and these are different from social systems. But if general systems theory is correct, there's a lot of things which are similar. So the upper symbol here is the integration event, and the lower tree symbol is the diverging or fragmentation event that happens because of the integration event. And they kind of hand off to each other all through from the Big Bang all the way up to human civilizations. And again, we'll see about 70 such events. We're going to be discussing that this Saturday at 8 a.m. If you're invited. So fragmentation sets up the situation for a needed integration, and then the needed integration sets up the situation for the next fragmentation or diversification, I like to call it better. That's why they're called ID cycles, diversification. And that happens endlessly from the Big Bang up to the present time. And we see just the levels, which is, you see the little eye up in the corner over here. We see these in nature, and we see a big gap in between. So hierarchies are level, gap, level, gap, level. And these are different types of systems that originate by origins for the first time somewhere. And this is a series of integration, diversification, integration, diversification. We don't see the connecting ones as a field. So it rationalizes the level gap level pattern seen in naturally occurring hierarchies and in human ones too. And unstable aggregates are possible, but do not occur in nature below the line of stability, and so we don't see them and we can't measure them. So they're actually outside the center line of the Wilson-Troncale limit, which is about here. The complexity increases across here until things become unstable, and that's called the Wilson-Troncale limit. So continuing now with the third level of workers or institution, Bejan at Duke University is a mechanical engineer, and in 1995 he talked about the constructal law in thermodynamics. It's a very specific formulation for circuits, but he recently has written a book called Evolution of Everything in 2016, which generalizes constructal to all levels. And he got the Benjamin Franklin Medal of the Franklin Institute, which is significant. And then David Christian, Macquarie University in Australia, has recently come up in the 80s and late 80s and 2005 and 2018 at the Macquarie University. Now, this guy here is the second picture here. He's a Russian historian. In fact, that was his big specialty for a long time. But lately, he's been talking about what he calls the Big History Project, and he's gotten a lot of attention from it. He's even funded by Bill Gates in the millions of dollars at Macquarie University for doing a history of all the universe. So basically, he's taking all this scientific work and making it into history. And then Stuart Kaufman, well, actually, this is not David Christian. This is actually Stuart Kaufman here at the Santa Fe Institute. He's got several books out on emergence from 1993 to 2000, but notice these are all much later than the 1972 work I first published, or all that coursework from the 1975 about to 2008, where I taught this at Cal Poly. But it's not easy to cite me, apparently, and so no one knows about that work. But his emergence is different from my emergence. And then Dr. Tyler Vogt, is an ecologist, and he's been writing lately on this kind of big history from the Big Bang on. He's an environmental biologist who worked for NASA. He's got many teaching awards, and he looks at meta patterns of form and function in mostly biosystems. But recently he published a book called Quarks to Culture. Look at that, Quarks to Culture. That's that same span from basically the Big Bang to our modern civilization. But he has a stronger emphasis on biological origins, not so much the evolution of systems. And recently, in our own ISSS, Eric Chasen, well, no, our ISSS, actually, Eric Chasen is from physicists and astronomers who've been working on cosmic evolution for a long time. He attempted to unify complexity science with a thermodynamic emphasis. And David Rousseau is the second picture there. Gary Smith, George Mobus. Mobus's new book that we have at the bottom here actually is concentrating on this grand sequence. But notice this grand sequence is just a continuation in dynamic science of what that great chain of being was, organized by the philosophers, although it's disciplined by our current scientific reductionist ideas. And George Mobus took over the Clear series on Springer, and he's continuing with this new book on the grand sequence. So there are some similarities and dissimilarities between all of these groups. A lot of the scientists restricted themselves to one series of touching disciplines. I say touching because they're interdisciplinary, like that's supposed to read biochemistry or biochemistry to cell biology. The origins of life, in other words, is kind of interdisciplinary. But they don't go across the wide set of levels that we do. Many of these universals focus on thermodynamics or energy flows, which is kind of related to systemness. But Marzoff notes that this is Tom Marzoff in ISSS, and he's a systems engineer, that most do not focus on systemness. It's not the origins of systems, it's the origins of specific systems from their isolated conventional discipline point of view. But my USSO has always looked at origin of systemness, and that's why I think they all should cite it. Okay, that's done now. Experiment 2, the Frontiers of Science course, and this idea of the grand synthesis from the Big Bang all the way up to current culture. Now, Experiment 3, or Systems Education 3, is a core course I'm running right now, an Introduction to System Science for Systems Engineers. And I got involved in this because of invitation of the Faculty of Engineering. It mostly was from the Industrial and Manufacturing Engineering Department, who was told by the dean to start a systems engineering graduate program. And I suggested all systems engineers should have a core course in systems science. I mean, chemical engineers study chemistry. Aeronautical and mechanical engineers study physics and mathematics. Shouldn't systems engineers have a grounding in system science? And they agreed, but at the same time, they said, who's system science? So now I'm teaching a core course. It's the very first course in the series for the masters on the foundation in systems science. Not the foundation in systems thinking, although I review systems thinking and things like Ashby's Law and Russ Akoff and Churchman and operations research and Jay Forrester, MIT systems dynamics. but I show that those are not system science. But I tell my students they should be getting a grounding in system science because engineering should depend on science. So this particular semester, the department chair said, I want this entirely online. So all of my 30 lectures are now online. And so the topical coverage for 15-week semester is on the next 2 slides, and it's only 2 slides. And it requires an online quiz every 2 weeks and a semester project. And actually, it's not 700 points. Now it's 940 points, as we'll see. And I want to just go over the topics here. First of all, look at the weeks in blue. Second of all, look at the capital letters yellow in about the middle here. And each one is a short 90-minute presentation of isomorphies, which I think are the basic mechanisms by which stable systems or sustainable systems work. So I go through hierarchies, feedback, cycles and cycling, self-organization, and networks in just the first 6 weeks. Notice that every 2 weeks there's a quiz on the PowerPoints, and this core lecture is actually 2 hours, and I look at the major schools of systems thinking and of systems science, the basic SPT contributions and what systems processes theory is like, which is my theory. And continuing weeks 7 through 12, notice that I continue with what I call the information lab, which is on the isomorphies of flows and storage, synergy and synchrony, fractals, symmetry and duality, fields, limits, constant number patterns. I think we go over 20 isomorphies, but we don't have time for more than that. And I continue developing the basics of systems processes theory and linkage propositions, and some spin-offs like systems pathology and systems mimicry. And we continue the quiz on each time. So that gives you an idea. We continue with origins and emergence as isomorphies. And then actually, we actually have this 2 Tuesdays, which we're recording as systems education and the unbroken sequence of emergent origins and theory of emergence, which I'll be doing the next 2 weeks. And those are basically lectures, lecture numbers too. I don't have the lecture numbers on here for some reason. We don't have to worry about this because this is how many things are going to be covered. Now, what is the extent of this detailed information in this online course now? It's 50 hours of online lecture on system science, but it's mostly systems processes theory. That's equivalent, actually it's more than a 3 to 5 unit conventional course. So it's a very intensive online course. There's 30 lectures, some are 2 hours, some are 1.5 hours duration. I have a collection of more than 2,500 PowerPoint slides, and they're stuffed with information or graphics like these slides I'm showing you right now. There's 500 megabytes of information and detail, and it's backed by systems resources. In this office I'm sitting on in Claremont, California, Peter can tell you about that, but he had to, because of family obligations, he had to leave us, so I don't know what's going to happen. We'll just close it off, and I guess the recording will stop at the end, but hopefully it's carrying on so I can change this to YouTube. The method of PowerPoint delivery is all the filming of the PowerPoints was conducted and filmed professionally at our Cal Poly University television studio, and it's available using a URL from that if you're part of the course. The science included was peer-reviewed or sourced from tenured faculty in 7 science departments at Cal Poly under grants from the National Science Foundation. And all of these, can be available. In fact, Peter may offer it through Ashland University and his own co-exploration university. Think of it, you guys. Instead of a department of biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, we anticipate in the co-exploration university departments of feedback, departments of cycling, departments of self-organization. In other words, looking at and intensively studying the isomorphies that go across all of these levels, from the Big Bang up to human, instead of the conventional breakup of nature. This would be a huge experiment and advance in systems education, in our opinion. See coexploration.net for his website on his university, or it may become a MOOC, which is popular nowadays, which is a massive open online course, which might have 10,000 people. It will become 2 textbooks, which I hope will be accepted by Mobus's Springer series. This is a tough course. There's no points for attendance, but there's 7 online quizzes for 140 points. They have to do a literature search analysis, and this will enter the INCOSE relational database for 250 points. They have midterms and finals of 200 points. They have to do a poster and culminating PowerPoint talk for 250 points at the end of the course, and they have Blackboard discussion points. Altogether, there's 940 points of challenge for this course. So it's very rigorous and demanding, in my humble opinion. Of course, this is on the science of systems, not on just thinking about systems. This course can be easily transformed into a MOOC because now there's 30 filmed parts of it. And we haven't done the post-student evaluation instrument. Between you and I, from my integrated science general education work, which I presented in 125 slides or so last time in this series, and on YouTube. I think that the students are going to prefer not having it totally online, although it saves them, hundreds of hours each semester in terms of driving out to Cal Poly. And now the final set of slides, this last experiment. What is the history of decades of systems education studies in our society? You know, I haven't been keeping track of time, but this is not going to be a 2-hour talk. It's going to be a less than 2-hour talk. There have been many ISSS past meetings and products on systems education, and it really upsets me that people don't realize this, who are just now joining the society and are starting it all over again. So what can we learn from these past ones? What is the record? Well, 1 and 2 goes back to 1976. That's, half a century ago. Look at the title. It's focused on general systems theory, and it was my early years, and this is us discussing things here. Models for training environmental education teachers utilizing the general systems paradigm. I actually got funding for this of $400,000 from the Department of Education in the 70s to make a national model for environmental education. But in the end, they didn't like the general systems approach that I was using. And so HEW transferred it, the project, to Bela Banathy's Far West Laboratory. Bela Banathy was the president and managing director of ISSS before I was. My Institute for Advanced Systems Studies used a wide range of systems processes to teach environmental education. That was what we convinced them of to get the $400,000 to begin with. Now, environmental education is really important nowadays because of climate change and so on, and because of our environmental regulations. And it has spread rapidly since then, but never with the total systems emphasis that we advocated. So this has not been disseminated. And there's actually 2 reports, first and second, before they transferred it to Bela Banathy's Far West Labs. And they're here in the International Business Office for the International Society for Systems Pathology, which I've started in this Wilson office. Incidentally, for those of you who don't know, the ISSP last week was designated by the Internal Revenue Service of the United States as a 501c3. So we can accept your gifts and you can deduct them. In 1979, as part of George Clare's NATO grant, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and year of effort, he not only did a bibliography on systems, which I haven't included in this, and I could as another report. He had Roger Cavallo, one of his faculty, write this systems research movement report for NATO. I don't know what happened with Roger Cavell. I'm trying to follow that up. He was managing director of ISSS at that time. So sort of it was co-sponsored by ISSS and not just NATO. It focuses on systems research, not particularly systems education, but how could you not talk about systems research without talking about systems education? So I think it's still relevant to systems engineers as well as to ISSS. It's 131 pages, and I have it here in the International Business Office collection. Here's a fourth product in the 1980s. Now, Bela Banathy was managing director of ISSS for 4 years, and I don't know, he was like the 23rd or so president, and I have to fill that in. I forgot that I didn't do that. My project of 76 was continued at the Far West Labs, and they spent more than $1 million of the U.S. Office of Education money. And this is his content source book. It has a 700-page intro to general systems mechanism for environmental science with examples. This was supposed to be the teacher training model for the national model for environmental education. The head of that unit at the time was kind of interested in general systems as approach. I think he was quite correct. So this was tested in several San Francisco high schools or schools, but it was never disseminated as a national model. I don't know what happened to this report. It should still be available from these Far West laboratories. I don't know. But I do have it here and some copies of it here since I was the beginning of this grant series in the IBO. Considering the climate change threat and applying systems to national impact is still a problem, so this stuff is much needed. Then the fifth product actually was from 1985. It was a global workshop on system science education. Look, San Jose, it was sponsored by ISSS actually. Held in Long Beach, California, sponsored by the ISSS. All the attendees were ISSS. It discusses 18 system science education programs, and they're described. It's more than 300 pages. The distribution, though, was only to participants, and I, of course, have it in my International Business Office collection here. A sixth product was people wanted a monograph of greater detail, so we did it. The 18 programs are described in 55 pages, and 6 standalone courses, like the one I just described. No, but not the one I just described, Frontiers in Science, that I described for you. That's not included in this. When was the summer of 1985? It was sponsored by the Far West Laboratory in San Francisco, also by the International Systems Institute, which was an entity founded by Dr. Bela Banathy. I don't know since his passing whether that exists anymore. The distribution is unknown for that, but I have it here in my collection in this office right here. A seventh product was somebody did a doctorate in system science program analysis. It was for a master's degree in systems by Victor Muglia, and I have it here in the IBO, transferred from the University of Louisville to USC. Well, when this happened, the International Business Office for what was the ISSS or ISGSR went from University of Louisville, because James G. Miller had retired and they closed the group there, to the University of Southern California, near me here, because I was managing director at that time. There was at the USC an Institute of Safety and Systems Management program, which has since folded. So there's 150 pages total here with a bibliography of 14 pages and 11 appendices. I have it here in the IBO. Then as an eighth product, you get the idea. All these new people are getting interested in systems education, but I'm saying, woo, you should know what this past stuff is, okay? Note the year here was 1989, which was what, 30 years ago. It was the upgrade of former. It was sponsored by the ISSS. It has 107 systems education programs described with under 25 subject locators in an index. There's 65 systems research centers that are cited there, 33 professional societies that touch on systems. I don't even know if you could get such a list nowadays. 187 systems research people from 29 nations, 140 systems journal. And this was collected by Blaine Snow, and it's here in the collection at this International Business Office. Who was Blaine Snow, it says there? Well, Blaine Snow was a graduate student who was interested in studying systems. And when he couldn't find a catalog on systems studies, he just made his own. So it's called Education in System Sciences, Annotated Guide to Opportunities. But it's old and dated, so it was advanced further by this Blaine Snow, sponsored by Fritjof Capra's Elmwood Institute. But it was also used in the ISSS, and I have it in my collection here too. And finally, I think this is the final one, the 10th product in 1991. ISSS was part of the early participants in WISNet. It's still dated given the current situation. It was sponsored by the World Institute for Systems on the Internet. And this was kind of an Eastern European federation before the IFSR, International Federation for Systems Research. This was before the fall of the Iron Curtain. I visited as managing director for a year at the University of Vienna as a visiting professor. And in that year, I traveled extensively through the Western nations and the Iron Curtain nations, going behind the Iron Curtain. Lots of interesting stories there. I don't think WISNet is still in existence, but I have the systems directory. So we're now at the end of this talk. The conclusion or lessons, I don't know if we can really make conclusions, but I would like to see these discussed at ISSS instead of starting completely anew without seeing all these past histories and past citations. So let's do a quick review of deceased systems education programs. It's kind of sad. The USC Institute for Safety and Systems Management Department is deceased, and they had millions and millions of dollars of funding, incoming students, and they had many graduates. The University of Colorado had a systems education thing at the school level, which is kind of like the college level. It's deceased. San Jose had a master's program at California State University, San Jose. It had many students who graduated from it. In fact, our current managing director, I think, graduated from it, and that is deceased. Remember, James Miller started the Systems Center. It had lots of PhD and master's students as well as undergraduates, but it's deceased. I had a minor which had 17 courses that were transdisciplinary that were funded by the National Science Foundation, but as soon as I retired, they eliminated them from the catalog immediately. Aki Bosch, the 55th ISSS president, had a school-level systems education program at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. We've had our annual meeting there. That one is deceased now. Robert Trappel's program at the University of Vienna that I joined for that sabbatical year in the 80s, even though he was founder of the International Federation for Systems Research, which continues, and had a very strong conference series on systems research, which had several publications, and it's in most libraries. Claire was very active in that. That's deceased also. I don't know, ICCS that was run by one of our plenary speakers at NEXI has stopped also because the organizer got tired of doing it. And I think Trappel's conferences too. So why is all this stuff lost? And I think it's because of the change in administrators. Trappel retired. So Akoff is dead now. What happens to the systems emphasis at Wharton School? Jay Forrester has just passed away. what happens to the systems dynamics emphasis at MIT? I think it's continued even though Donella Meadows passed away also, because people like Cabrello, or I think that's his name. I can't think of his name. Is become very popular now. Clear's program at SUNY Binghamton, where is that going? I talked with Marty Zwick about the Portland State University, one of the longest surviving system science PhD programs, and he's about to retire, but he and his colleagues don't want to retire until they get a promise from the university that the system science PhD program will continue at Portland State, but they can't get that promise, and so I don't know what the future is to hold there. Of course, there's bigger units like the Open University in the United Kingdom and special online programs at Santa Fe, NEXI, and the ICCS, which I hope will continue. So why is it that these things have gone away? I think this is the last slide, or the next to the last. Don't change administrators. No administrator is high enough. Even the president of the University of Louisville, was not able to keep the systems education program going after he departed. Be awarded lots of external funding. Most of these groups are outside the conventional disciplines, and so they survive because they're bringing in money. And of course, what university in the modern corporation sense denies external funding? Plan for legacy and turnover. Make sure that you have people in position already who are interested in systems that will continue your organization. That's a mistake I made for my institute. We must somehow enable jobs and job categories for system scientists. People hire systems engineers. That's why there's a 17,000 strong International Council on Systems Engineering, which has funded this particular office twice now. But people, you don't see many ads for system scientists when we need them so much nowadays because of the stuff that I have in the last item here. We need to accumulate more exemplars of successful systems application. That's our fault for not showing that it's such a powerful thing to use. We have to go beyond belief systems to these exemplars because people right now in this society do not believe in belief systems. They believe in demonstration. And don't discount what we are up against. We're up against a lot. Look, I can give you stories on this too. Government is divided up into the conventional disciplines. Library organization, Dewey Decimal System, and so on, is divided up into conventional disciplines. And of course, we have the academic departments at virtually all universities. There's departments of biology, chemistry, astronomy, geology, but not departments of feedback and cycles and cycling and self-organization. Publishers are organized according, there's editors for the physics textbooks and editors for the astronomy textbooks and editors for the chemistry textbooks, and they won't allow anything else in their domain except that it's standard chemistry and recognized as such by the consensus. And this permeates our society in every way. So how do we change this over to the new way of looking at things? I don't know. It's a difficult question. And that's the end of my slideshow.